Hey, everybody. All right. Hey, everybody. It's Lindsey Purcell from Purdue University, Urban Forestry Extension Specialist in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources. I'm here tonight to talk about pruning, sporting my Fallen Families t-shirt. I think Carson's going to be talking about that later. So I hope everybody's staying safe and free of virus interruptus and doing their thing and without any problems. So I'm going to get right into it here. If you have questions, type them in the chat, and my trusty partner, Kale, will be monitoring those, and we'll take a few breaks and ask some questions, and then we'll take a break about halfway through. So got about an hour and a half or so of content here. I could talk for a whole week on this. In fact, I do when I teach my students at Purdue, because there's just so much stuff about pruning. One of the most important activities that we do, and especially the fact that you're intentionally wounding the tree and causing the tree some strife. So we want to make sure we do it properly. And I'm going to talk more about from a little different perspective of problem solving tonight. So it's a little different perspective. Some of this you might have seen in the previous webinar or heard me, but it's a little different spin, a little different information. So we'll get going from there. So I think we can move on with our slideshow here. So this is problem solving. I'm proud to say that we are arborists, professionals trained in this science and practice, and as Shigo called it, an art. And we are problem solvers, typically reactive. And usually we're doing these pruning actions based on the tree owner's needs or being responsive to unpredictable environmental conditions. And the challenging and often really the overlooked part of the client relations is being proactive with that problem solving to create sustainable tree structures. Now, for a tree owner, manager, the goal is to manage a tree that performs the functions on the site. And for arborists, our goal is to create a sustainable, stable form to prevent failure. Again, problem solving to create a stable structure. As we'll discuss, we're going to look at the problems that can occur with pruning and our tree structure, and then we're going to talk about how to take care of those. Some resources here real quick. These are on the Purdue Education Store. A lot of what I talk about is in here. A lot of companies will use these for training tools. There's a couple videos there. So if you want some additional resources on pruning, check that out. All right, let's go on here. Hopefully everybody's aware of the standards. The standards, there's 11 parts, and each of them the ANCA 300 is part one, deals with pruning, but each one deals with a different aspect or practice in arboriculture. Part one is pruning, and the purpose is to provide specifications and, more importantly, directives on how to properly prune. Now, the ANSI standards are a lot of shalls and shoulds and do's and don'ts, but the BMPs that accompany, as you know, ANSI writes the standards. Go ahead and click there, Kale. ANSI writes the standards, but the nice part about it is ISA comes out with a BMP or best management practice that always follows this. And this is I think the third edition, but this is probably one of the most comprehensive BMPs I've ever seen relative to pruning. So I urge you to get it and take a look at it, because it could be really helpful in moving forward and learning a little bit more about the pruning systems and pruning processes. Let's begin with problem solving. Pruning is what I call critical thinking. So really, when we go there, I mean, we get calls all the time as arborists say, hey, I need my tree pruned, or I need something done up in the crown to improve a situation. So I like to ask myself, why are we there? What is the purpose or the problem to prune for the solution? So what can we do for the tree owner to solve their issues? That's what I try to be as a problem solver for the client. And usually has to do something typically with health or safety. And I look at those health maintenance should always be an objective when we're up in the crown pruning or even pruning from the ground. And of course, keeping people safe in and around trees. But the most compelling reasons to prune is to produce a good structure which reduces biomechanical defects and promote longevity. And it comes down to primary objectives of safety and health. So if you see it, cut it, basically, within reason, of course. So go ahead. Reducing the risk of failure. This is probably one of the most important things. Now, preventable and predictable, we'll talk about that. But what we want to do when we're pruning is think about not just reducing or cleaning, but think of what we can do to improve weak branch structure. To prevent situations like this. This is the kind of issue that leaves homeowners really frustrated when they don't have a sustainable branch attachment and dominant leader system. And, this is a situation where, it's an ash tree, I know, right? But it has been treated. They invested a lot of money in it, and then it fails. But we can understand why, obviously, with the codominant and included bark. So, this is one of the things that we want to look at first, as well as the health part of it. Now, preventable and predictable, as I mentioned, yes. Basically, if any of you that have taken the tree risk assessment qualification, we've talked about preventable and predictable failures. And if you're a climber or anybody in the industry that's making decisions on risk should consider taking that qualification course. But anyway, when we see these happen in the canopy or on smaller trees, we're like, yeah, I knew that was coming. Codominant stems are weak structures, and those are issues that can be prevented. Oftentimes, the tree shouldn't even have been planted to begin with, or the homeowner or tree owner may have inherited that problem. And so as a result, we inherit those poor branch structures, which result in things like this. So, and we'll talk about this when we identify these examples are of an age and developmental stage in their life where they could be pruned and improved fairly easily. Now, as we get further along in developmental age, medium age trees and mature trees, then it becomes a little more challenging, and that problem solving and critical thinking and understanding and abiding by the physiological demands of the tree is much more important to us when we're in that process. So moving forward, just a review, make sure everybody's on the same page here. As far as codominant stems and branches, we know that they're trees with 2 or more stems. Usually they're very similar in diameter. They emerge from the same location from the main trunk. Now, what are often called branches are not really branches, but codominant stems. But we can also have codominant branching as well, especially up in the canopy, and those also are predisposed to failure if you get enough load on that defect. Codominant stems form those narrow branch angles, and eventually they develop included bark depending upon the type of codominance, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that here shortly. But this is another ash tree. This was the only tree in the lady's yard, and she'd been treating it, and again, it split. It's like, okay, what can we do to improve that situation? Now, at this stage, wasn't a whole lot. It might be a candidate for cable and bracing, but again, we want to try to, by and large, I've talked to a lot of people that have been in this industry for a long time, and codominant stems and branches are by far the prevalent types of failure that we typically see up in the canopy. All right, let's go ahead to the next one. I want to take a closer look at another codominant, and this is one that has this is in a parkway. I was bike riding I carry a camera everywhere I go. It drives my wife insane. In fact, she looked at my iPhone. She said, "You have more pictures of trees than me." So not a good thing. But anyway, this is one that obviously is a codominant. You can see branch aspect ratio is very similar, but this one has had a little time and resources to create some wound wood and perhaps seal that split. Now you can see that there's some air or light in the junction there. That's a different type of bark inclusion that we're going to talk about here shortly. But remember those two trees, the ash tree that split because of the tight branch angle, and this one had a little bit more room, and we'll see why this really occurs. So going to the next one, as you can see, trees are codominant in all sizes, shapes, and forms. This was a 70-inch bur oak, and the lady bought the property next to her to buy. She basically bought a tree and got the property with it, but she wanted to protect this. Again, you can see it splitting. That's my notebook down there at the bottom. But honestly, this could have been prevented, but you know what can you do at this point? It may be a candidate for bracing or cabling, but my gosh, it looked like a hardware store in there. I'm not sure it's possible. I measured you'd have to have a 9-foot brace rod to make that work. But again, they come in all sizes, and the idea is to get to them and prevent this situation from happening while they're still in that younger developmental age. All right. So this is kind of a graphic representation to give you a little better idea what I'm talking about. So what I call hotspots are especially where there's included bark in the branch union. And this is what results in those cracked stems. Obviously significantly more weaker. If we click and see the tip down there at the bottom, we've had lots of researchers from the godfather of pruning, Ed Gilman, and also Tom Smiley and Brian Kane. Go ahead and click again. You can see that they're obviously significantly weaker when we do branch load testing, and they split apart much more readily than a good strong branch attachment with the proper connection of fibers. When we talk, I mentioned branch aspect ratio earlier, and this is kind of a new terminology. It's not really new. It's basically something old that's new again. This was talked about probably, 40 years ago or more. It's a very strong term in other industries, but we've been able to apply this to ours to give a better predictor of what type of attachment strength we can expect. So we want a branch aspect ratio that facilitates a better attachment strength. And we used to discuss branch angle as being the most important part of the attachment. And I can remember when I was in school and early career that they were talking about it's more about the angle, and anything less than 45 was a bad branch attachment. It was predisposed to failure. But that's not necessarily the case. Now, branch aspect does play a role in this, but branch angle plays a role in this, but what's more important is understanding the ratio. So you basically have primary stems, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary stems. And each one of those should be at least half of that to its parent stem. So you can see on this one, if you took this branch, the parent stem's on the right, and then you can see the secondary stem coming off on the left there. So you can see that's about a 2-to-1 ratio, or 50%. That's what we're looking for. Branch angles are around 30%, no big deal. But that's what we want to see as far as a good, strong branch attachment. Okay, go ahead. So this is a good example of one that I pruned out of a tree earlier, and you got the branch attachment there. Would you consider this a good branch attachment or a poor branch attachment? It's got the angle. We can see the branch collar, branch bark ridge, but click on there. You can see that this is, go ahead and click again. You can see that this is, whoop, can you go back there, Kale? Yeah, you can see this is a poor branch aspect ratio. This is more of a 1-to-1. So what we have is what's going on is what's important is what's going on inside where the interlocking or intertwined fibers are, and the branch should be going further in. Now this one, this is another good example of a poor branch aspect ratio, and you can actually I dissected this, and you can see the included bark and the decay that's actually starting to form on this stem. So another good example. Now this is what you would see as probably worst case scenario of a codominant as opposed to the previous one. So if we have to make some decisions or problem solving on what branches to take, then this would be one that would be first on the list to try to improve as far as stability. Here's another one. You can see this is, again, this was a Zelkova, and again, 1-to-1 ratio. You can see the branch aspect ratio is very weak. We got included bark with decay. So, why did this split? Pretty much of a no-brainer. It was predictable and preventable. And Brian Kane more recently has done a lot of research that shows that where you have branch diameter roughly 70% of the trunk diameter, it's half as strong. So that's a significantly more weak attachment as opposed to that improved branch aspect ratio of 50%, or having that central dominant leader system in these trees. Really, when it comes down to it, our recent research has shown that failure is really a challenge with a good attachment. My colleague and a fellow alumni from Purdue, Greg Dahl, he's at West Virginia now. He's done a lot of recent research on branch allometry and trying to understand why trees fail and where they fail the most. And what we found is, you can see that on this particular branch, that on both of them, you can see that intertwined overlapping fiber, and it goes halfway into that primary stem on both of these. So there's no way that that's going to break off as a result of loading. So as the tree gets bigger, parts get bigger, but also that overlapping material where the branch bark ridge is going to continue to grow and wrap around it as well. We found out through research that branches that have good attachment actually don't fail at the attachment. They actually fail about 6 to 12 centimeters further out on the branch. So obviously, it's not a matter of loading the attachment, it's loading the branch and exceeding its ability to hold its holding capacity. So again, a good attachment, it should be pretty sound regardless of the loading, but farther out on the branch, we could have some other issues. A colleague that I just recently made acquaintance with, Duncan Slater in England, has done some recent research that has really helped understand that interaction or between branch attachments. And one thing I'll say, we look at branches, as you see in the top of the image there, we look at branches and trees in general as oversimplified organisms. The cartoon images and graphics and diagrams are basically made so we can grasp and understand it. But when you look at the tortuous grain that you see on that inset down below, I mean, it's not that easy, and it's not that simply explained. So the branch attachments are just much more complex than our previous models might indicate. So this new anatomical model that we have from Dr. Slater shows that interlocking wood grain, which gives it its strength in that branch attachment, if it's a good attachment and if it has the proper branch aspect ratio. It forms an incredibly important connection between the branch and the stem, increasing that strength. And so what will happen is, again, we've also learned that as a result, because of this tortuous grain up here, we found that a majority of a conductance occurs on the bottom side. As you see on these images, you can see the branch bark ridge has this crazy twisted grain up there, and there's not a lot of conductance they found or set flow in those areas. Most of the conductance is down at the bottom towards the branch collar and around the sides. So, we're learning new things all the time about branch attachments, and our modern pruning practices should continue to use that all-important branch bark ridge as guides to correct location of final cuts, because that's going to solve the problem of sealing and healing those pruning wounds much more effectively. Branch collar is important to watch for, especially on younger juvenile plants. But as a lot of you know, when climbing and pruning, oftentimes the branch collar never develops. And so the branch bark ridge is the most important thing we need to look for. So as I mentioned earlier, not all codominant stems are alike. There's actually two different kinds that we look at. So we have down here at the bottom, this is what we call bark to bark contact. Very narrow branch angle. You can see you can see the included bark, and that has a much higher likelihood of failure. So if these two bulges of wood develop around a bark inclusion, then that's when we have problems. Now go ahead and click. Now when you see this next one, this is a codominant also, but you see this cup-like structure here. And to split them apart, they do have a branch bark ridge there, so they have a little stronger intertwining connection there, rather than the bark to bark contact. The bottom one is much more likely to fail than the top one. So as you might imagine, separating these would have a lot different effort on the top than the bottom. So if you look at these, you can see different spectrums of bending strength if you were to do a pulling test. But what we're trying to work on in the research and testing is trying to find grades, 3 to 4 grades of codominance to help guide us in what we should do in our practice and what we can do to perhaps do less pruning or focus more on the more troublesome attachments. Okay. So when I talked about failure, preventable and predictable, and you can see this is and load on defect. This is kind of helps to explain that a little bit. So this was a tree that failed, damaged the garage, but Norway maple, wasn't a great tree to begin with. You can see it's multi-stemmed and it's got a poor attachment there, but they wanted to keep the tree. Okay, so let's clean that up. But more importantly, I want to show why this fails and why that load on defect and problem solving pruning makes a big difference. So if you look at this branch on the left here, click again, and you can see that it's about 35 feet in length. Yeah. So and this is an overextended branch, so it's about 35 feet in length. Well, if you remember our tree our physics, go ahead and click again, Kale. You can see that basically, if we have 25 feet, we have 25,000 foot-pounds of torque on that defect. The defect is here where it attaches a branch, so that's a lot of weight. I mean, unimaginable weight on that defect because of the weight of the branch. So if let's say it weighed 1,000, that branch weighs 1,000 pounds. So go back, please. So you can see if that branch weighs 1,000 pounds at 25 feet, that's 25,000 foot-pounds of torque on that. So that's a lot of weight. So what we want to do is prevent and problem solve for the client or the tree owner to prevent that failure by creating a more sustainable structure. Okay, go ahead. So the best thing to do is to go ahead and click again. The best thing to do is to, again, what we want to do is reduce the load on defect to solve the problem of potential failure. So as we start moving the branch back and pruning to a proper lateral, we're taking weight off that. Okay, we go again. You can see we take it back to another one. Now, the diagram here that Jeff drew, my friend Jeff Harris, who does a lot of my graphics, may not be exactly the right branch aspect ratio or to the third lateral, but you can see the point here that we can reduce this down. So we've basically eliminated about 10 feet on this branch. So we've basically eliminated about 10,000 pounds of load on that branch attachment. So that's the problem solving there. Go ahead. That's a problem solving there that we want to think about when we're pruning is what can we do to prevent that disappointment of failure for the tree owner. So, again, reducing the load on defect and doing the loading out on the periphery again is so important. We don't want to remove any interior branches because that's just creating a lion's tail situation, redirecting our center of mass, and creating a higher likelihood of failure as a result of that. So it's and remove the mass damping impact. So again, we always prune on the periphery. All right, let's go ahead. So what can we do? Again, when you're dealing with a codominant, what we want to try to do is develop that central leader, dominant leader, remove any weak structural attachments. We may need to suppress those larger competing stems because depending upon pruning dose, which I talked about previously, we may surpass, depending upon age, vigor, and developmental age and health. We don't want to exceed that pruning dose. So we want to create attachments that consider the branch aspect ratio and angle. So, it's not just getting up there and cutting, man. It's what I'm trying to say is you got to think about it a little bit. And I know there's a lot of good artists out there that can prune effectively and solve those problems pretty easily. So, Kayla, is there any questions that's come up so far?
I do have a couple questions here.
Okay.
And I don't know if you're going to get into some of these a little bit later. So if you are going to get into it, if it's going to be answered later, that's a totally legitimate answer to it.
Okay.
The first one here, I've got to find it first in my notes. Here we go. What trees are important to identify before trimming, like the American linden?
I'm not sure I understand the question as far as identify.
That was one of the first, I guess. Are there different trees that you need to identify and treat differently if you're going to start pruning them?
A couple things come to mind. It's important to know what the natural shape of the tree is, whether it's an excurrent growing shape or decurrent, so that you can kind of maintain that, because that's due to their hormonal impacts. They're going to grow that way. The other thing to think of is from a plant healthcare standpoint, we want to make sure we identify trees that are susceptible to contagious diseases that can be transferred or transported on our pruning tools, such as obviously oak wilt, apple scab, things like that. So it's good to know your trees before you start pruning.
Okay. This next one, I'm not. Once again, I'm the tech guy, so
we'll give
I'm
you a
not
little
sure
break,
if these.
man.
I don't. Yeah, we'll just go for it. This is a question. I have established beauty bushes that I want to keep, but only bloom on the top now, about 10 feet tall. How do I get them looking better and not kill them in the process?
Well, if we're talking about shrubs, that's a little bit out of my wheelhouse, but I am aware of like rejuvenation pruning. Some species really like to be whacked back. burning bushes, lilacs, beauty bushes, often spireas. Man, about every 3 years, I'll cut them down to about a foot, and they'll resprout based if they're healthy and have the carbohydrate reserves in the root system. They will come back and look like new shrubs. So check to see if they're able to withstand that rejuvenation pruning, and you should solve that problem, because most of your on the flowering shrubs, your flowers occur on the youngest branches, and the old stems won't create flowers.
Okay, this next one, back into trees. Oaks sometimes have two distinct swellings that appear to be the branch collar. How do we know where to cut to?
And that's a good question. When I was, and we'll get into this a little bit, when I was early career starting to prune, they were saying, get the branch bark ridge and branch collar, make good collar cuts. But as I mentioned, we all know that when we get in the tree, we don't always see those. And you can't spend 15 minutes saying, oh, I think that's the branch color. Joe, do you think that's the branch color? Would you take a look? I mean, it's not like that. So we have to make decisions. And all of it comes down to the branch bark ridge. And I'm going to show you some examples that I've created in those scenarios that will kind of give you an idea of what to do in those situations. And hopefully you can get some good guidance from those.
Okay, good answer. Hold on 1 second. I have to search for every one of these. Are maples the hardest to compartmentalize?
Well, actually, I'm going to get to that.
Gonna get to that. Okay.
Yeah. I don't want to steal my own thunder here.
You kind of got into this, which was kind of cool to see, because this was asked before you actually started talking about Dr. Slater. What are your views on Dr. Duncan Slater's views on his work regarding unions and branch forks in trees?
Yeah, we kind of talked about that a little bit. I've been following Duncan on his LinkedIn page, and actually have had some conversations with him, and very insightful young scientist. And he's actually doing some good work examining these branch attachments. As I mentioned, Shigo had cutting edge information, but was somewhat limited in content delivery because of technology. And so Dr. Dewey Siefken in Germany and Dr. Slater in England, the Europeans have really been doing a lot of work on this and examining those a little closer. And I think it's going to be good guidance. So if you're not following Duncan on LinkedIn, check it out. He's got some really good information on there. He's a very aggressive, very passionate researcher. So I think he's on to something here. And again, some of the graphics and information I borrowed from Duncan was, I thought, very appropriate and timely.
Okay. We'll have to check him out, Dr. Duncan Slater. What is the best cut for removing one side of a poor union where the ratio is 1-to-1?
Okay, we're getting pruning cut questions now. Yeah, I'm going to be getting into that here next. So why don't we just go ahead and move forward, Kale?
Okay. All right. I have one more. Hold on. Let me find this. One more here. I've got. Can you play us a tune on one of your guitars on the wall? Hopefully, a song about tree trimming.
Maybe we have time at the end. I'll play my favorite arboricultural song, or at least a snippet. Okay.
Perfect. Sounds good to me. All right. I am ready to head on.
All right. Let's lock and load here. Okay. Well, getting back into it, we're going to talk about pruning cuts. But before we do, I want to make sure we're kind of all on the same page again. I know there's a lot of different abilities and talents on these webinars, and we just want to make sure everybody's got the same concepts, or what I call important generalizations about pruning. And these apply to about any situation. To make good pruning cuts, not every branch is alike, but you need to remember that healing afterwards is the biggest concern that we have. So at the very least, you are altering the shape of the plant or the morphology. You're also changing the physiology. I love to talk about the responses of trees to pruning, the hormonal responses. Some amazing things happen in the tree when you make a cut or when it's damaged in any way. Also, it's good to remember small cuts do less damage to the tree than larger cuts. So we want to go small as much as we can, or think suppression more than we do removal cuts. Um, Proper technique is essential for that coat to occur. There's a lot of things going on about pruning sealants and all that stuff, but the best thing for it is just a good pruning cut. And I also think that we don't spend enough time talking about the developmental age and the health and vigor of the tree. Now, when I talk about corrective pruning and pruning response in detail, I get into that quite a bit more, but we won't do that here. But again, those are things that we need to think about regardless of the situation or the tree. Okay, now we'll talk about pruning cuts here. Again, just kind of so do a little review so we're all on the same page. There's two important items to identify on here. The branch bark ridge. Go ahead and click and click again. And the branch collar. So, and as I said, not every tree is going to have that branch collar, not every limb. But every single attachment, unless it's bark on bark codominance, every one of them is going to have a branch bark ridge. So that's our guiding point in that process. Okay, let's go ahead. I'm going to show an example here. Go ahead and click again. So in a removal cut, it's pretty easy to do, especially when you're doing groundwork and you're training new trees, which is one of the most important things that we can do. We look at basically 3 cuts in the process. And so we make an undercut at an indistinct, non-descriptive distance out from the connection or attachment point. Then the next step is a top cut, usually just outside of that first cut. And then once my wife's actually pruning that, beautiful picture, isn't it? This is the whole purpose behind that undercut about a third of the way into the branch is once you start pruning on the top, then what's it going to prevent? That tearing and ripping. So this is exactly what you want to see. What timing was that, man? Okay, and then the next thing we see is this is usually what people leave behind, and that's what causes problems. And to solve those problems, we got to get rid of those stubs because there's nothing there to support that. And that's just a conduit for decay into the tree. So our third cut is that removal cut, which is basically just going to the branch collar and branch bark ridge, and we make a beautiful cut there. So that's pretty easy. Everybody knows that. And the whole idea behind this is to identify these so that we don't damage the branch protection zone. So if that branch collar or is removed or damaged in the case of that final cut where you get a flush cut, if you click again, there's what we call the branch protection zone, and there's some specialized phytochemicals that are located in this area that facilitate the healing process. And so if we damage this or reduce it or cut into it, then we basically hinder that plant's ability to heal quickly and effectively. Because remember, when you make that cut, basically the race is on. So it's either the fungal organism is going to invade, attach, and decay, or the tree is going to seal that up, which eliminates a good environment for the fungus and it stops the decay. So that fast, effective healing is so important for the health of that tree. So we'll start moving into the cuts. So what I'm going to do is show you some scenarios here real quickly on different types of cuts and their applications. So, reduction cuts, again, it's easy to find if you can find the branch collar. But the objective here is to find the cut angle and position that minimizes the surface area of the cut, as well as the bark and cambium dieback behind the pruning cut. So you can see that we want to make, basically when it comes down to it, we want to try to minimize the amount of exposed tissue. So obviously you can see where on the small letter A is there. If we angle that down, we're going to increase the size of that pruning cut, and that's just more tissue that tree has to compartmentalize and seal up. So when we do a reduction cut, again, branch bark ridge outside of that, but also try to minimize the amount of exposed tissue. All right, go to the next one. Now, it gets a little more trickier here when we got reduction cuts, especially if you don't have a branch collar or you've got kind of a weird branch angle here. So the reduction cut needs to bisect the angle that's formed by the branch bark ridge. So what we'll do is we would draw an imaginary line perpendicular to the axis of that cut stem. So we take like a 90-degree angle off of the branch bark ridge, and then our cut would be anywhere within that 1, 2, and 3 on the one on the left. And same way with the other one. So you're looking at about a 30 to 45 degree cut, final cut from the branch bark ridge or the stem bark ridge. So if on the left you see it's going straight up and down. So if you go 30 to 45 degrees outside the branch bark ridge and out on the branch, then that would be where your final cut is. And oftentimes we want to perform the cut towards the retained lateral, because especially if you get into those narrow angles, you're going to damage the lateral that we want to retain. So oftentimes with your chainsaw and a pruning handsaw, it gets a little tight in there. We don't want to damage that cambium layer. So same thing with the one on the right. We want to take a line that's perpendicular and bisect that to a 30 to 45 degree angle. So again, I always try to cut on the side of minimizing the amount of exposed tissue. So if you go to the next slide, you can see kind of a live version of this. So I looked at the branch bark ridge where it's located, draw a line there, and then my cut would be 30 to 45 degrees off of that. Now, if you do a straight line across where you've got a 90-degree angle there, then you would just kind of half it. And, it doesn't have to be perfect. Look, I know, we're swinging from a rope with a chainsaw. We're trying to get it done. And, it doesn't have to be perfect, So you just try to get within that 30 to 45. I think the most important thing is that you're outside of that branch bark ridge. Now, if you go to the next one, you can see kind of a similar situation with a removal cut, and you can see if we're reducing the size of that. So you can see where the arrow is, the branch bark ridge kind of goes at an angle there. So we want to go 30 to 45 degrees off of that as well. It's kind of a slanted. Some guys like to leave it flat on top, but that doesn't facilitate healing, because on the opposite side of the branch bark ridge, where the branch collar could or should have been, that's where the most conductive tissue is, and that's where you're going to have cambium dieback most likely to occur. So that's where we want to make sure we get that good angle, minimum amount of tissue exposed. Okay, next one. Now, as I mentioned earlier, when we're doing removal cuts where the branch collar is visible, lucky you, that's easy to identify. You got 2 points. To draw a straight line, you need 2 points. Well, this makes it a little easier to do when you have that. Removal cuts are usually to do a crown lift or establishing a central leader in some situations, as we saw earlier. But that's an easy one. Go to the next slide. You can see in the canopy there, you can see this one's an easy one where I could see the branch bark ridge actually came out really far. Kind of that branch attachment was really pronounced there. But you could also see the branch collar somewhat. So that was an easy cut to make. You can see about where you need to go, because if you go deeper into that swelling of that branch attachment, then you're going to start getting into that branch protection zone. And that's when you're basically exposing more tissue, and you have less effective sealing of that open wound area. So that's an easy one there. Wish they were all that good. Now the removal cut with no branch collar visible. Again, the final removal cut needs to be between line 1 and 2. So again, the angle of the perpendicular line to the branch bark ridge needs to be about the same as the lowest possible cut. So if you're looking at that imaginary line there, and then you can draw or cut 1 is almost perpendicular to that, or cut 2. So somewhere in between there, but again, where I make my decision is based on the angle of the branch, and so I get the smallest wound possible. That's kind of my guiding principle there, and determining where that angle is between that 30 and 45 degrees. So real important to kind of think about that before you make that final cut. But again, the branch bark ridge is the easy one. You find that, to go outside that. But, where you angle your saw, that's you got to kind of look on the lower side of the branch to make sure you got the right positioning there. So the next one, here's kind of a good example of what it should look like. So if you click a couple times there, Kale, you can see the branch bark ridge is the yellow dotted line. And then I made a cut, or excuse me, the red line is where the branch bark ridge is, perpendicular. We want to make our imaginary line, regardless of the orientation of that main stem, whether this is in the canopy or on the ground, doesn't matter. But we want to draw a perpendicular line with the angle of the limb or the stem. And then we would want to go 30 to 45 degrees outside of that. So this total angle between the branch bark ridge and the green line should be between 30 and 45 degrees. So again, there was no branch collar on this. You just don't see it on this oak. And that's when you have to make those decisions. So on the next slide, you can see this is a kind of a similar situation where I was just doing a removal cut for clearance for a line. And you can see that I made a line perpendicular with the stem, kind of the way the stem goes there where the arrow is, and then 45 degrees off of, or straight down off of that. And then anywhere about where that yellow line is where I thought was the best cut to have the least amount of exposed tissue. So that's what the final cut should look like. So again, like I said, it's sometimes tough to figure out where to go with those, but as long as you're, again, thinking outside the BBR and then also smallest wound possible, then you're gold, man. All right, so if you got included bark, so this was kind of alludes to one of the questions that we were talking about earlier, and I get this question a lot. So if you got included bark, how far down do you go in there? It seems like sometimes that inclusion goes, way down into the branch. I'll show you a couple pictures of that here. So where do you go with this? Well, according to the standards and the research, especially Ed Gilman did down in Florida, we want to remove that branch or that stem with the included bark by cutting as far down into the union as possible without injuring that retained trunk. So you want to cut down as close as you can to where that double ridge is, or merges together at the bottom of that inclusion. So you can see on those examples here, this is where we would cut. It looks like you're going pretty far down in there, but what you will likely find is actually just included bark. You won't be exposing cambium. You'll just be exposing bark that has been compressed with the branch or the stem or the branch there that you're removing. So you can feel pretty comfortable with that. You know, if you're a little sketchy about it, probably the best thing to do is, you know, you can piece it down and kind of cut to where you feel comfortable. Start feeling comfortable with making that pruning decision when you're trying to solve that problem of removing the codominant. So the next slide kind of shows you the kind of the live scenario here. So we see here's a codominant, and you can see that bulging area there. This is that bark to bark contact that I mentioned earlier, very weak. You know, this is huge load on defect here where the branches attach, and very weakly 1-to-1 aspect ratio. Just, you know, the dictionary definition of codominant with bark inclusion here. So, you know, what do you do? So again, two things can happen here depending upon age and health. We can either completely remove it, or we can stage it down in successional prunings. You know, take subordinate it half and then come down the next half. But you can see where I made the cut. Where the red line is there, it's right at the bottom of where that double ridge meets. So that's, you know, it looks like it's a long way down there, but that's the best place to make that cut. So the next one kind of shows a similar situation, just a little more complicated. This was kind of a wacky branch attachment here. And you can see we actually have a couple of different situations going on here. We've got 3 stems with a similar branch aspect ratio. And you can see the one on the right is more of that cup-like. It's kind of almost on the cup-like, but the reason it's not is because you can see the bulging, which indicates that there is no branch bark ridge there. So that's the weakest of the two. So whenever if we want to remove this or subordinate it, depending upon how big that branch is, that would be where our final cut would be made. Then the next one shows a great image of both types of codominants, the cup-shaped on the right, and then the V-shaped on the left. And you can see the left, that included bark goes way down to where that arrow is. And on the right, you can see the yellow arrow where that's going down to. So again, if you have to make a decision on solving a problem of failure, the one on the left is more likely to fail than the one on the right with the cup-like bifurcation. So if you need to remove one first and wait because of pruning dose for the next one, then I take the one on the left. And I know it looks like you're going to go way down into that, but that is where you want to take that. And what you will find exposed is compressed bark on both of those. Okay. Another question I get asked about a lot as far as problem solving is stub removal. Where do I prune? What do I prune? And it's pretty easy. We see these stubs all the time, either from nature, storms, or a lot of times from bad pruning cuts. But you can see that knot-like structure that forms at on the oak tree here at the top and on the right. So what that is that's wall 4. That's the barrier zone trying to grow out around that thing. And I'm sure you've seen especially on sycamores, we see them pretty frequently, is those big bulges or burls that grow on the side. Those are most likely pruning wounds, and that thing will just keep growing out until it actually surrounds that stub. It's a decayed area. It's trying to compartmentalize, it's trying to wall it off so it doesn't get any worse. So if we can facilitate that by cutting it off, don't injure the wound wood around there, but we cut it off, then it's going to seal much more quickly. So that wall force trying to form. Okay, so moving forward, I'm going to quickly go through some scenarios here for problem solving to try to prevent situations like this. I think I have talked about this a little bit during the corrected pruning. We'll kind of go through these a little fast, but might stop now and ask questions, and then we can take a break. Kale?
Let me pull this up. Here we go. All right. We have quite a few questions. I'll try to get them here to some that are what you've been talking about.
Okay.
So I have a question here from Ian. He's asking, would it be better to err slightly on the side of cutting into the collar a little, or leaving a little extra branch stem?
That's a good question. And I would say I would err on the side of leaving a little extra stub if you're not quite sure. Because, well, if you cut into the branch collar, you're definitely creating a bigger wound, and you're also getting into that branch protection zone. So you're creating a bigger problem for the tree. Now, if you are leaving that, especially that bottom side where the branch color is, if it sticks out a little further than it needs to, what'll happen is you'll see a little bit of cambial dieback on the underside of that branch. It kind of grows in a 45-degree V at the bottom. And if you're able to go back and check on your pruning cuts, it's interesting to see how they respond the next year. And if you see that, then you can bring it back a little bit and you can solve the problem.
A little bit related to that, I think. This is, I think, Jen's. Asked if you could cut into wound wood that has started to seal up around a piece of dead wood or old stub, will you eliminate its ability to properly compartmentalize that area?
If you remove, it depends on how much of that wall for that wound wood you remove. But if you remove any part, or if you cut into something, but again, the greater tissue you expose, then it almost has to like start all over with the sealing process, and it's likely going to facilitate quicker dieback or decline into that branch, because that wound wood is highly lignified material, and it's very tough. And if you cut into that, what happens? There's a lot more conducting vessels in that wound wood, and so as a result, you're going to get fast healing. But if you remove that, then you're going to run the risk of not having that sealing ability because it's that wall 4 is missing.
Okay, this is going back to you were talking about some of the cuts, and you had one that was a very vertical limb that you had pruned, and Guy was asking, shouldn't we avoid leaving horizontal wounds due to exposure to sun and spores, etc.?
It's not so much of the orientation of the wound, but the size. Now, there's been some discussion about that and disconnect on it, but found that water really doesn't sit because it almost develops a suberized coating on top there, and it really doesn't sit or facilitate the rotting anymore because it dries out fairly quickly. But it's more about, rather than the angle, it's more about the size of the wound. So, if you're a little more horizontal, then that's okay, because as you cut down, you're going to have a greater angle here, which means a little more exposed tissue. If you want to angle a little bit to facilitate watershed, I don't think that's a problem. I mean, we're talking about minuscule amounts of tissue here, but the angle isn't as important as the size of the wound.
Okay. And how do you choose which codominant you're going to cut?
Well, we like to think that it's going to be easy with, obviously one's going to be more straighter. Ideally, we want one that's kind of, just a little bit off like this, So it's like, oh, we're definitely going to take this one. But it doesn't always work like that. Usually, I mean, they're just perfectly bifurcated. They go straight up, and it's like, all right, which one do we pick? And I do quite a long case study on one that we did on campus. And we had a red maple that was just perfect 1-to-1, perfect V. Now, you're going to have to choose one, and it's a challenging decision. Choose the healthiest, most defect-free, and either subordinate or cut the other one off. Now, the tree's going to look funky for a while. I mean, it's going to look one-sided, but when you remove that one side, what you're doing is you're opening up for light, which light actually inhibits auxins, which improves cytokinin flow, and those little branches that were on the stem left are going to start getting more resources because its neighbor's gone, but also the cytokinins are a hormone that flushes growth. So you just got to educate your customer, your tree owner, and say, look, man, I'm saving your tree. It's codominant. It's going to split. It's just a matter of time. So if you can live with a little ugly duckling face here, trust me, I'm an arborist, right? Trust me, it's going to be fine. So it's just a matter of kind of dealing with some growing pains there during that process.
Okay, I think that's a good kind of segue into plugging one of our next webinars coming up with Nick Araya, who's really good about telling homeowners why they need to spend that extra little bit of money or do something that might not seem to them like it's the best idea. I know he's specifically got a lot of great terminology and buzzwords that he uses. So look out, there's a webinar coming out for that pretty soon, with another one with him coming out. We do have a little bit of, I mean, I'm not going to lie, we have way more really good questions on this webinar than we've had for many of the recent ones. So we've had a lot of people talking about the process of cutting your codominant down, whether you're just taking it all off at once or if you're taking it in section by section over time.
Well, that's a good question, and I think that I addressed this very thoroughly in that last webinar that I did, Kale, corrective pruning. So if they want to check that out, and I'm going to talk a little bit about it here coming up on showing some problem-solving pruning for codominance. That's kind of a little bit of a repeat from that. So I think we'll address that here soon.
Okay, great. And let's see. Does angle, when you're dealing with included bark, does the angle at which you're cutting when you're pruning, does that angle count as much, or I guess is that as necessary to think about?
Well, the angle again, first consideration is outside the BBR. The second consideration is cut at an angle which has the minimum amount of tissue exposed, and getting the angle again, not so critical. It's about the tissue.
Okay. I am ready to go on if you are.
Yeah, just let me know when you want to take a break.
Okay. Let's see. We're on slide 43 right now.
Yeah.
You want to keep going for a little bit, and then we'll do the break?
Yep.
All right.
That sounds great. So, if anybody needs to get a beer, feel free to do so. I'll talk slow. Okay, I'm going to talk about established tree process. And again, remember I said our problem solving and critical thinking is about health maintenance and reducing the level of risk and reducing the potential for failure. So that's what we want to look at. So this is one of my trees. This is on an established tree. It's been in the ground about 7-8 years. And I'm going to turn this into a virtual tree. Click. Go ahead and click. All right. So this is my virtual tree, courtesy of Jeff Harris, great graphic artist and arborist. What we're going to do here is, again, if you look at the BMPs now, we don't talk in terms of crown thinning, crown cleaning, we're talking about objectives when we communicate with the client now. So our objectives are here, as you see on the slide, is reduce the potential for failure by establishing a central dominant leader and making sure that we don't exceed the pruning dose for that session. And all of that comes down to determining how healthy that tree is will determine how aggressive we can be. So what's important is to, I don't know how many times you do it, but I think it's important that we take a look at some of the tips and look at the internodal growth and see how well it's been growing the last 2 or 3 years. That'll make a difference. Okay, so our first slide here, go ahead, we'll move forward. Our first slide here, so obviously our defective area is that codominant. It's got a high likelihood of failure. So what we're going to do is we can either do this in 1 or 2 sessions, or we can do it all at once. It depends on, again, developmental age and vigor of the tree. So, but these are different cuts. They could be completed all in one, or maybe spring, fall, spring, spring. Again, very situational. Okay, so click again. So our first reduction was that other branch. Now see, if we just stop there with that first cut on the first reduction, we still reduce the load on Defect, some of that torque that's on that branch. But our goal is to remove this completely in order to remove that codominant that's going to, as parts get larger, their load on defect gets greater, and so the opportunity for failure increases as well. So that's what we're trying to do, is just beat that process and solve that problem before it becomes an issue. And so that's what it's going to look like when you've had that second reduction. And so we still got a codominant up there on the right that's prone to failure. So we're going to go ahead and remove that again. Depending upon health and vigor, that might be exceeding the pruning dose for that particular tree. So we may want to stop, but that's what we want to the tree to look like when we're finished, to create that strong, stable structure. So the next slide shows the tree complete, and that's everything that we took off. So if you look at that, that's a lot. It's more than 30%. So we need to think about, can we, I've pruned as much as 60, 70% on a healthy tree and without any repercussions. But if it's stressed, drought stressed, urban tree having problems, then we may want to complete that over 2 or 3, what I call 2 or 3 pruning cycles. Okay. So, it's about recognizing defects, and a lot of arborists don't really look at them in that perspective. So I challenge you to think about it, pruning from a problem-solving perspective. Now, how can I make this tree last longer and be a greater asset to the property and to the tree owner? I think that's a different mindset than what we're used to thinking whenever we get up in the tree. Okay, so moving to the next one, we're looking at medium age trees, and I'll kind of go through this scenario here. This is trees in the age of about 25 to 50 years. They're still young enough to divert and direct growth into desirable areas of the tree by removing other living parts, which is very important in the allocation of resources. Now, to decide how much to remove and from where to remove it, that's the problem-solving process. We need to determine how the tree is going to respond, and then adjust our dose and position of pruning from removal to perhaps subordination accordingly. And this is the most difficult part of it to teach and understand, because again, it's very situational depending upon the tree. So here's our next victim. So this was a red oak. This is one that I worked on with my students. Red oak had the objectives again. So if you look at that, we're like, okay, it really doesn't need pruned, or does it? I mean, can you identify the defects there? Well, certainly. First, the homeowner wanted the crown lifted in order to keep from knocking himself out when he was on his mower. It doesn't have a dominant leader. I mean, it's a red oak, the only tree in that yard. It's very important to this family. So we want to make sure we develop that strong dominant leader. We want to balance the crown for stability. And then we may want to subordinate or reduce some of the weight on other codominants in the process. So we'll turn it into our virtual tree. And this is what it looks like now. Now, the next click will tell you what it would look like if we did nothing at all. And again, this is mine and Jeff's um, guess on what we would happen. So we can identify the defects there, but we can see, this is what would happen if we did nothing at all with the right loading, most likely wind. So we move forward here. So these are two, I call our tree risk assessment, we call our conditions of concern. So these are defective areas, and those are the things we need to problem solve for and determine what to prune to make that tree more stable and sustainable. And so if we look on the right, you'll see that those are the two areas that I want to remove. If we were doing a single session cut, then we would take those two stems and either subordinate them, but if we're doing them in a single session, we click again, we'll see that we're going to remove both of those conditions of concern. So you can see where the circles are, another circle there at the top, we've basically eliminated that opportunity for failure there. Now, if you go to the next slide, so say we want to say this is not a healthy growing tree. So we want to do this over maybe 3 sessions. So I'll go through it like this. Pruning session 1, we're solving the problem of multi-stem leader, and then also we're trying to figure out how to improve the stability of the tree. So pruning session 1, again, every time we take a limb off of that codominant, we're reducing that torque or load on defect there. So I go to the next slide. We've reduced the main subordinate, or excuse me, the main codominant. Now we're going to go up in the canopy. Got a couple other codominants. They're going to get bigger. We're being proactive here, problem solving. Okay, keep going. We're still in session 1. We haven't really gotten crazy with our dose yet. And you can see that we got another codominant up there. So we're going to take a chunk out of that. And so that kind of concludes session 1. Now we go to, now again, depending upon developmental age and health and vigor, we'll see, say, all right, oftentimes you don't get this opportunity. It depends on the client. So if they say, we would like to say, look, ma'am, we've exceeded their pruning dose or getting close. I don't want to further put the tree into stress as a result of all this removal of live green tissue. And so we'd like to come back next year. You like your tree, don't you? I mean, you don't want it to be pruned any harder than it needs to be and perhaps further jeopardize its health. So hopefully you can educate your client and have the opportunity to come back. We don't always have that though. It's like one and done. You got to do what you can, and hopefully it works out for the benefit of the tree and the tree owner. But if you get 2 sessions, and this is what we would do. So the next slide shows that where we further reduce the weight on that. Go to the next slide. And now we're in a position where we can take off a big chunk there. So we're actually removing our big offender there, our biggest load on defect, which would destroy that tree. And then you can see we've got a dominant leader system starting to develop there on the right. So further, remember our objectives. Our next slide shows we want to lift the crown a little bit in order to improve clearance for the tree owner. And then the next slide shows it's kind of a little few nip and tucks here for small codominants being proactive here and kind of balance out the sail a little bit. So we have the more balanced damping as the winds or the wind energy impacts that tree. So if you look at the next slide, you can see how the kind of the finished product there and what we all took off. So that's pretty much, we're done, and we're happy with that. Now the next slide shows how much we really took off. I mean, that's a lot. And if you did that all at once, you would throw that tree into a hormonal resource frenzy. So again, if you're only able to prune once, you'll probably want to subordinate and pick the biggest issues and hope for the best. But if you're able to do it in 2 or 3 sessions, then you can take off 30% or less and then kind of work your way to your objective. So that's kind of what we want to accomplish in that process when we're solving that problem of dominant leader and making sure it abides by the physiological demands of the tree and paying attention to that more. So, okay, this might be a good place for a stop. I got a few more slides here, Caleb, if we want to take a bathroom break here and chill for a few minutes and show some fun stuff. We've got some entertainment coming up, some promotional stuff. So we'll be back in about 6 minutes to finish up and then answer some more questions. So hang tight, man.
We have a bunch of great webinars just like this one scheduled on our Facebook page, so make sure to RSVP to the Facebook event pages for updates. On June 25th, you can tune in to our webinar about aerial friction and rigging techniques, hosted by Rich Hattier. You can earn 2 free CEUs by watching live. On July 18th, Nick Orea from Tree Care LA will be taking over our Facebook Live page and broadcasting a cabling webinar live from a tree. There will be 2 free CEUs available for everyone who watches live. On July 30th, Taylor Hamill from DMM will be broadcasting a climbing webinar from the canopy of a tree. If you watch live, you can earn 2 free CEUs. On August 13th, you can join Trent Dix on a webinar about how to make money with plant healthcare. Keep checking our Facebook events page to stay up to date with all of the great webinars that are on the horizon. If you're looking to share your opinions with TreeStuff and make some money, you're in luck. You can film a TreeStuff review and earn gift certificates for use on TreeStuff. Just film at least 1.5 minutes of your opinions on your favorite TreeStuff products, and we'll put you on the site and send you a $10 gift code per video. To start reviewing, head to treestuff.com/review to read the video requirements and upload.
I'm Carson with TreeStuff.com, and I'd like to ask you to take a second to learn about the Fallen Families Fund. It's a charity created to provide small cash donations to families who have been affected by the death or injury of a working arborist. All of the administrative costs are covered by Cheryl Inc., so 100% of your contribution goes to help families in their time of healing and recovery. You can learn more and donate at www.fallenfamiliesfund.org.
Geocaching is a fun TreeStuff program based around searching for hidden treasure in the trees. Volunteer arborists from around the world have set caches in their area for climbers to seek out using GPS, their wits, and their climbing skills. To start geocaching, all you have to do is go to treestuff.com/treeocache and find a cache near you. We have a few new geocaches to announce. Brandon Othen of Arizona has set Geocache 87 near Phoenix. Sid Howells of Social Climbers in the UK has set up 2 geocaches, number 108 near Southampton and number 109 near Guildford. If you'd like to find these caches or any of the other caches around the world, you can request the coordinates at treestuff.com/treeocache. The North Carolina TreeStuff Party has been rescheduled from April until August 1st. It's hosted by Nick Johnson in Waynesville, North Carolina, and will go from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. Stuff Party has been rescheduled for September 5th and is being hosted by Jason Dudek. You can find more information on the TreeStuff Facebook events page. For more information and addresses, head to our Facebook events page. You can also get more information about these and upcoming TreeStuff parties by going to treestuff.com/parties.
Keep your mouth shut and your ears open. You've got to truly humble yourself every day and realize that one bad decision will be your last if it's the wrong one.
Never stop learning. learn and study a good arborist as much as possible. Watch them, watch how they work in a tree.
You know, get their 2 cents, especially in business. That's been the biggest challenge for me is finding out that a relative degree of skill will not carry me through, that I needed to be diligent as well about the business side of things.
If you haven't already gone to some sort of trade show, competition, whatever, get out and just shake hands with people. You'd be amazing. You'd be amazed how welcoming everybody is and how much they want to be there to help you. It's pretty inspirational.
Don't just take one person's advice, seek out as much information as you possibly can.
And also realize that it's not a single man sport. This is a team sport. It's a team occupation. And how we interact with each other and how we make each other feel is just as important as how great you can climb and how wonderful you can rake.
You gotta expose yourself to greatness. You don't settle. If you feel like you're gridlocked and you're not learning, move on and go find somewhere where you can learn and grow, So that's probably the best advice I can give. Soak it up like a sponge everywhere you can get it.
All right. Hey, welcome back. We're going to kind of finish up here with a few things regarding, I mentioned pruning and problem solving. One of the biggest problems, not necessarily for us, but for the tree, is healing. We have to, trees in the built environment, we have to intervene because of structural conflicts, safety, clearance, risk, all those things. So we have to prune. And it's oftentimes better for the tree in the long run from a plant health care standpoint. But we are intentionally making wounds, and we need to make sure that we conduct due diligence in that process so that the tree seals and heals as quickly as possible. Now, every tree behaves differently going into the mature tree process. It's a totally different world than, say, the tree in that 25 to 50 year range. Now, here we're looking at veteran trees with a 50 plus year range, especially in the built environment or older. But they've reached about 75% of their max size. Or some trees of this age and older might be entering retrenchment. And so, it's a totally different thought process, critical thinking when you're pruning. And, the reason I'm very passionate about this is the fact that, Americans are very sensitized to risk. Again, this is my opinion. And I think the reason why we don't have a lot of big trees in our urban areas and in the built environment is because as trees get bigger, parts get bigger, people get more fearful of those trees. If they find anything wrong with it, their acceptable level of risk is low enough to where it's like, I don't want to worry about it. Cut it down. And I've run into this scenario here twice this past week with a 74-inch sycamore and a 78-inch white oak. And they're in retrenchment. They're not necessarily pretty, but they need some work, and they still have some, I believe, have some life into them. But we need to make sure that when we're pruning on mature trees, that we have justifiable objectives. There better be a damn good reason why we are pruning, especially live green tissue. Now, we need to focus on risk mitigation first and foremost, and then look at removing non-beneficial plant parts, so anything that's dead or dying. We may want to correct some structural defects, especially if it means a higher likelihood of failure. But we need to be very mindful of our pruning dose. I've had long conversations with Dr. Gilman about this as far as what's the dose for what age tree and so forth. The older you get, the less you take off. So when we're looking at mature trees, we're looking at 10% live green tissue. And like on the developmental, the medium age tree, we're looking at, 30% or around there. On younger trees, that 5 to 7 years in the ground, I prune as much as 70 or 80%, if they're really bad. So a lot of it has to get very case specific. So I won't get into the details on mature tree pruning too much because there's really not much we should do. So that's why I say do nothing. But we want to prune to improve structure. We may want to combine with structural supports. We may want to look at relieving the mechanical stress on these larger branches. Again, we're trying to improve the structure for the tree so it stands safely and for a very long time. We should not be taking any live green tissue off unless we absolutely have to. One of the things that we do want to look at, though, and recent research has indicated that older trees often get a lot of epicormic sprouts in them, and those are good to remove because those epicormic sprouts are diverting resources away from where it needs to be taken up critically in other places. These epicormic sprouts have high water demands, and they don't contribute anything to the carbon sink. And so they're just basically need to be removed. Now, I will add a caveat there in the fact that if it's a storm damage or top, then we may need to look at leaving a few of those or even cultivating a few of those in the improvement process. So we go ahead and move on there. Again, if you're going to prune these trees, especially as they get older, no interior pruning. Everything should be on the periphery. This is classic lion's tailing. This is down in Texas. And actually my brother's neighborhood. And there's an arborist who loves the lion's tail, man. There's an epidemic going down there. I had a ton of pictures, but this is so dangerous. This is elevating the crown, raising the center of mass, and creating a higher load on defect with the attachment. And that bending moment there is really putting a lot of torque on that attachment at the stem. So that's why when we elevate those crowns like that, we're really not solving a problem. We're creating a bigger problem. Okay, we're going to go ahead and move forward here into the final phase here, the pruning wounds. We talk about coat it a lot and the impacts of that. One of the things that I think is important to understand is trees heal and they seal the wounds if possible. And I'll get into that more later. But the whole idea is the occlusion of that exposed tissues. You can see on those two examples here, that donut shape, that's wall 4, the boundary layer that's trying to seal that up as we want that to happen as we see on the oak above it, because once it seals that up, then man, the trees, the fungus doesn't have the light and the moisture and the air to proliferate, so it's just going to kind of stop. It's just going to kind of go into a state of dormancy there, if you will, and not move further into the tree, wall 1 and wall 2 and wall 3. So we want to wall off or seal those areas quickly as possible. The next slide shows you kind of an example of how that progresses. So this was a maple that I was doing a crown raise on, elevating the crown for mowers. And that's the day I pruned it. Then the next slide shows 150 days later. And you can see that that wall 4 boundary layers starting to form. There we go. You can see the tissue, it's not decaying back there. So, but you can see the donut starting to form. That's that wall 4 boundary, that reaction wood there. It's highly lignified. Lots of phytochemicals in there to try to reduce decay. And then the next slide the next click shows after almost a year. And this is quick, effective closure of that wound. Now, according to Dewey Siepkin, research, this full occlusion of wound wood on an injury such as pruning can be anywhere from 1 year to 10 years. Again, it depends on the resources available and a lot of other factors there. So next slide's kind of a fun slide. This is actually just, again, furniture. You can even see compartmentalization on furniture. You know, we love wood grain and we see those. And you can see where, you can even see the overlapping tissue on the right, where that branch was and where it started to, where it's sealed over on those. So, you know, arboriculture's everywhere. You can't even go to a restaurant without taking pictures and seeing our industry alive and well. But you can see where it's sealed over there. That's what we want to accomplish. That wall 4, and you can actually see on that picture on the right, the decay. It sealed over so quickly, the decay stopped right there at the pruning wound and did not progress into the stem at all, into wall 3 and wall 4. So that's the idea. That's at its best. That's what we really want to see accomplished. So, as I mentioned, there's some parameters here. So, to solve the problem of wound closure, we got to consider these factors. So, the first is we need to think about the diameter of the branch, or the size of the branch we're removing, the age and health of the tissue, and the tree's ability to compartmentalize wounds. Now we click again, and the ability to compartmentalize depends upon 2 things. The activity of the parenchyma cells, and those parenchyma cells are part of the symplast, and they're the living cells that store food in the form of starch, and they also have specialized fungistatic properties to help reduce decay. Now, if they're active and growing and healthy and happy and singing kumbaya, then they're going to compartmentalize quickly. But the activity of the parenchyma cells rely on the time of year. Remember, the trees need to be actively growing, the cells actively dividing, which means during the growing season, but also the availability of stored materials. So if it doesn't have the energy and resources, then the parenchyma cells are not going to be able to help that compartmentalizing process. So, you know, a tree that's under drought stress or environmental stress of some kind, you know, horrible urban area, man, then that tree's probably stressed. That's where you check those internodal growth increments to see how well it's doing. You know, if they're really, I mean, I've seen like 1/4 inch for 2 or 3 years, and you're like, oh my gosh, this tree's suffering. Or you may see that, you know, 2 or 3 inches per year, then you, okay, tree's healthy, I can get a little more aggressive with it. And then finally, again, kind of alluding to that, trees will recover if they have the time, the energy reserves, and also genetic capacity has a lot to do with that. There was a question earlier about maples. Well, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence. There's not been really any definitive research on tree species. And on the next slide, there's a list there. Now, if you haven't seen the new Coded Principle Dewey Siefken wrote, it kind of builds on Shigo's research, and Gilman's done the same thing. You can see the lists in there, and you know, some trees are better compartmentalizers than others, and I've tried to kind of categorize these, but you can't. For example, you think hardwoods compartmentalize much better than, let's say, the softwoods. So an oak compared to a maple, especially in the Midwest. But there are some that are poor compartmentalizers that are Quercus species, like Quercus nigra, shoemarge. I mean, as opposed to, you know, Quercus robur, Quercus virginiana in the South, rubra. Some depends upon the species there, but some are good compartmentalizers and some are not. Again, a lot of that, if we don't know, we need to err on the side of the proper dosage, and then also during the growing season when the parenchyma cells are active, and then really pay attention to that developmental age. Now, that image on the right there, that was an oak tree that I went up to take a look at. I pruned that. That was pruned 5 years ago. It was a large branch. It was about 6-7 inch branch, larger than I wanted to remove, but had to because it was conflicting with the service drop. And so I just giggles. I went up to kind of check on it to see where it was, and it's compartmentalizing, but it's kind of slow. But the it's on a decline as far as vigor and health. So it's allocating its resources just to freaking stay alive rather than to wounding. So again, trees are very strategic about how they manage their lives, and they'll either allocate resources to growth or defense. And so they make a strategic decision, which is far beyond our comprehension or ability to explain, but that's what we know. So then the next page kind of gives you the recommendations, kind of finalize that part of it. So when it comes, and again, this is based on Dirk Dewey Siefkens. It took me about a year to learning how to pronounce that name. It's going to by a consonant. He'd had a sample of 800 trees, and this is what he came up with as far as best compartmentalization scenarios. So trees that are poor compartmentalizers, we want to minimize or maximize our cuts to no greater than 2 inches. Now, and on good compartmentalizers, 4 inches. Now, that's at one cut. Now, if you're going to subordinate to a point where you have to get to accomplish your objectives, and you can chunk it down, but you want to. If you're going above 4 inches, you better have a really good reason, because that's a huge wound that tree may not recover from. So on larger cuts, consider reduction or subordination rather than removal. Always avoid that damage to the branch bark ridge, because as we saw, that's where that connective, tortuous, twisted tissue is that is important for attachment. And then don't get too deep into the branch collar or that area where that branch protection zone is, so we don't reduce the tree's ability to seal up that wound. So, and if we're doing any intensive canopy removal, especially when we get into large branches, when we're looking at that max on good and poor compartmentalizers or greater, I highly recommend that you only do this during the active growing season, because again, this is when the parenchyma cells are most active and you're going to get the most fast and effective occlusion of that wound. Now, the caveat there is also, with the transfer of pathogens, if you're looking at oak wilt and things like that, then we got to make some exceptions there. But pretty much that's the way we should be considering the problem of healing and sealing after we inflict those pruning cuts. So, all right, kind of finishing up here. Next slide. Again, I urge you to kind of take the perspective of looking at pruning activities as a problem-solving approach. And critical thinking is required for all of our practices. And, I always tell my students, never let the situation exceed your skills. If we have, obviously, we have a lot of friends and colleagues with decades and centuries of experience collectively, and we need to draw upon that and ask questions, and just the fact that you guys that are on these webinars are learning more. I mean, that's a responsible, ethical arborist. I think that's so important. So and then finally, going a couple clicks there, Kale. Abide by the physiological needs of the tree. So, I love the dude, and I love his mantra there, the dude abides. Well, a lot of people prune based on business, whether or not they're making the money. But, sometimes it's not the greatest timing for the tree. And I think we need to be a little more cognizant of that, so that we do the best for the tree long-term and short-term for its health. So I think that's it. So I want to all personally invite you to the Indian Arborist Conference at January 26th through the 28th. We have speakers from all over the country come in. If you're not a part of that, look me up email me, message me or something, and I can give you more information on that. So, I want to thank TreeStuff too, Kale, our IT guy that helped keep things get set up, and Nick, with the invitation to come back to be a part of this webinar series. This is such an awesome opportunity to share information. I love talking about it. And I'm really excited when people want to learn more about what we're taking care of, one of the greatest resources on our planet. But just really privileged to be a part of this. And again, if anybody has any questions we don't get to tonight, feel free to email me. I get emails all the time from arborists from around the world asking questions about presentations, and I'm happy to talk about it. So we'll get to some questions. Before I leave, I want to tell everybody be safe, stay safe, and remember, everybody goes home.
Exactly. If anyone here needs to get a hold of Lindsey for any reason, you can go ahead and email us at media@treestuff.com, and we can get you his information. And he's a great resource to have. I'm sure we'll be having him back on another webinar. It actually, in the break, we were just talking about possibly doing yet another webinar on pruning and some thoughts of what we could do to make it interesting. In the meantime, though, all y'all have supplied quite a number of really good questions, I thought. I think this one here is from Jason Dudek. He is asking, a TreeStuff superfan, Jason Dudek.
Yep.
Thoughts on trees with multiple 3 or more stems from ground or short main stem / trunk.
Yeah, that's a good one, Jason. A lot of times we inherit those situations, and a lot of those trees that have grown like that are used, if they're larger, they're stump resprouts that somebody's cultivated and maintained, and then we're tasked with trying to create a sustainable structure on that huge lever arm and no stem. I mean, it's troublesome. Really, the only thing you can do is think about problem solving that failure where the condition of concern is on that lower part of the trunk. Because if it's a huge tree, you've got a large lever arm there, so you may need to subordinate some of those limbs to reduce the weight and perhaps reduce the sail there. Because you can't really, if you got 3 or more stems, it may need to grow like that because that's the way it's been growing for a long time. I just pruned an ash tree that was the same way. I'm like, oh my God, there's no way you're going to get a dominant leader out of this one. Not at this age. It was 20-inch caliper, so it'd been growing that way for a while. When I got up in the canopy, I just started looking at where the load was and selecting some branches to subordinate to try to reduce that load on defect and still keep its shape. So that's a tough one, man. That's kind of one of those, you got to do some critical thinking, and thinking about load on defect, I think, is really your only option there.
Okay. Moving on to, I guess, kind of related to that, I've got 2 other here what are your thoughts on removing codominant stems at planting?
Oh, man. I'm glad that was asked. I've always said that the landscape industry, the guys planting trees and designing trees, they have the biggest impact on the future of our trees than we do. I mean, they're planting trees oftentimes that have, most of these horticulturalists and landscapers don't have any idea about branch structure and sustainability. They don't see the tree past planting time, okay? It's out of their hands. And then it becomes our responsibility. But if you can do formative pruning when that tree's, in that 7 to 10 year range, and make that cut when the limbs are smaller and the tree's smaller, it's aggressively, vigorously growing, man, that's huge. I mean, I was city forester in Indianapolis for several years, and we planted a lot of trees, and my goal was to prune the tree at planting and then go back once within 7 years for any corrections or damage, and then never have to go back to it again. So that focus on the formative pruning saved us lots of trees and lots of work, because the bigger they get, the harder they are to manage. And the bigger the cuts, bigger the wounds, bigger the problems, so forth. So yeah, that plant, don't be afraid to prune too much at planting. This is one of those conversations I've had with Ed Gilman a lot. We've been told, don't prune at planting. We don't want to mess up that live green tissue and the resources. Well, we don't want to get too aggressive, but if you've got a serious codominant that needs to be cut, and you can't go back, and you can only do it at planting time, then get rid of that codominant, because you may not have the opportunity again.
Okay. And in the same maybe not the same vein, but when kind of the opposite, I guess, going to mature or slow healing trees, what are your thoughts on leaving stubs when removing large limbs on trees with a slow healing rate?
That's actually addressed in the standards, and that has been suggested on that very topic, and that it may be acceptable to leave stubs or prune to an improper lateral in order to reduce the amount of live green tissue, or leave some there. So, but if you're going to leave stubs, or basically what it is heading back pruning. But if you're going to do that, then you've got to make the commitment that you're going to go back and take care of that. Otherwise, then you've left a stub that's going to cause problems later on. But
okay.
I can't remember. But look in the standards, or I'm sorry, the BMPs. There is a section on that. There was a lot of research that went into that, and a lot of trepidation on whether or not to put that in there. But there's scientific background that supports that for a temporary situation.
Okay. Speaking of the BMP, someone was asking, does the BMP draw just from ANSI, or are there other countries' research that they're looking at, such as German and the Brits?
Well, the ANSI standards are very U.S.-centric. But the research that's gone into creating these standards have come from international resources. I mean, we have some rock star researchers from Europe that have contributed indirectly to this. Now, the committee, there were a couple of, I remember correctly, there were 2 or 3 international members there. So I think it fairly represents arboricultural practices internationally, but may not be specific to individual country as far as codes and protocols.
Okay. And sorry, I was just trying to post the quiz link there, and I'm getting even more questions as we go.
I was going to say, there's some CEUs to be gotten tonight, right?
Yes. Yeah. So I've just posted the link for the quiz. You have to get 16 out of 20 on that. And if you do that within the next 12 or so hours, you'll get 2 free CEUs. After that, the ISA isn't counting this as a live instruction period, but we'll keep it up forever, and it'll be worth 1 CEU. So you can come back if you're watching this in the future. You can still get a CEU for that. Let's see. What do we want to do?
CEUs are arborist currency, man.
Yeah, exactly. Here we go. Treating pruning cuts. Does it actually do anything to help the spread of any sort of diseases or funguses, anything like that?
Yeah. I've done a lot of research here or literature reviews on tree wound dressings, and there's the lac balsam, and there's the petroleum distillate stuff, which is the black stuff, which is no good, and then there's some sodium silicate solutions, and there's also people use latex paints, and tree wound dressings are never recommended, with the exception of painting wounds on especially oaks for transfer oak wilt. So what you're trying to do there is really not facilitate wound healing so much as you're trying to cover up or seal the pruning wounds so the phytochemicals aren't drifting off and attracting the vectors which spread the disease. So it's kind of like a temporary Band-Aid or kind of putting the lid on the pot so you don't smell the soup cooking, so to speak. So it's trying, because whenever you prune, whenever you scalp for insects, we create trap trees, and that's basically just injuring them. And because when they're injured, they put out these phytochemicals and that insects can smell, and they're like, oh gosh, somebody's injured, because most pests are pathogens of opportunity, and so they need an imitation, which is a wound. And when those vectors are attracted to that tree, they'll get on it, and then they'll spread it to other trees by landing on them. So yeah, they do help to kind of help maintain the vectors, but not the disease.
Okay. Nick Arrea has been trying to bully me into asking you this question. He's asking, Shigo says trees don't heal. Do you like the term healing when talking about trees as opposed to sealing?
Yeah, I've kind of changed my position on that. We've always been taught to say trees seal, people heal. But they do seal, but part of the sealing is a healing process. And the fact that, wall 1, 2, and 3 are take advantage of existing tissue. Wall 4 is new tissue that develops that boundary layer. And so I feel like that's a healing process when it develops new material that occludes that wound. So, I don't want to get caught up in the semantics of healing versus sealing. The whole process is just trying to cover the wound and recover from that wounding process as quickly as possible. A lot of people really get bogged down on that, but sealing is kind of a healing process. It's just more or less a euphemism for recovery. So that's a good question though, Nick. And I think we get we're rigid when it comes to that. I mean, we're scientists, and we abide by our researchers, what their lingo and language and terminology are, but we might want to take a look at that a little harder and not think so much as in those silos.
Okay. This is coming from you know what? I don't know. I lost it here. Here we go. Jeremy Scholes. Why would you cut at an angle if your objective is minimal surface area? Why not 90 degrees from the inclusion zone when you're talking about bark inclusion?
The idea is to try to, again, you may have to, the angle is not as important as being outside that branch bark ridge. There might be a situation where you have to cut at an angle or you have to cut horizontally. And again, if you look at the Gilman's book on pruning, which is where he gave me permission to share some of those diagrams, it discusses that those angles there's a pretty wide margin there. And there may be a situation where you have to be more horizontal, or you may have to cut at an angle. But when you cut at a horizontal level, you're more likely to leave that cambial dieback potential. Where if you cut at an angle, then you're not leaving so much as a kind of a pseudo stub, if you will. And that's the purpose behind the slight angle, is to reduce that cambial dieback on the underside of that branch.
Okay. Here's a quick one for you. This is Jeffrey is asking, what native Indiana trees do you like to push people to plant in their landscape? Your favorite one or two? Favorite Indiana trees? Who's your trees?
My favorite trees are typically not native, but some of them are. I really like the ones that have very few problems, like sweet gum. I know females, but sweet gums, one known pest. I like yellowwood. I like amber, macchia. I like golden rain tree. But I'd like to say something about the native thing. people are all about this native tree planting, but what's native about the urban forest? There's nothing native about it, and most native trees don't actually do well in the built environment. So there are some cultivated species of landscape trees that actually do better in the built environment in urban areas. Where you want to be careful with is choosing trees that don't become invasive and escape the landscape. So don't. There's a lot of purists that say, "Nope, not planting anything but native trees," but they may not do well. So take considerations on that and plant based on maintenance inputs and availability of those rather than the tree's pedigree.
Okay, that's a much deeper answer than I was expecting.
I'm sorry, that was the long one.
No, that was good. I've got one here from Ben, talking about epicormic sprouts. I've been working under the impression that epicormic sprouts are stress responses, and so it could undermine the tree's ability to recover if they're removed. Is this a situational thing, or have I been telling customers the wrong thing?
Well, epicormic sprouts are sometimes a response to stress, or they could be dormant latent buds that have been awoken by hormone influx as a result of pruning or some other wounding. There's a lot of reasons why epicormic sprouts develop. But they really don't contribute to the health of the tree unless we're in a restorative perspective there, or trying to improve canopy density, and we may want to cultivate and choose some of those as they grow and develop into perhaps a better branch. So it's a situational thing. I don't think you've been telling customers the wrong thing, but it may not be a good catch-all for every situation. So we just don't want an excessive amount of sprouts because, like I said, it diverts resources from where they really should be going, and they have really high water demands that also take resources away from the rest of the tree.
Okay, we've hit 8:01, which is about how long as this was supposed to last here. So, do you want to play us out?
Yeah, sure. Thank everybody for coming in and listening to the webinar. Now, every arborist should know one song, and I'm going to try to attempt to play that. Now, I can't sing worth a damn, but I can play a little bit. Actually, I'd rather play the bass than guitar, but see if you can catch this tune. If you're a fan, you know that song. There is unrest in the forest. There is trouble with the trees. For the maples want more sunlight, and the oaks ignore their pleas. If you're a Rush fan, you know that song. But
oh yeah.
What tree guy wouldn't like that? So hey, if there's any questions I didn't get to, be happy to answer those. Email me. I love getting those and talking about it. A lot of my friends here that I work with in Indiana, we collaborate on a lot of those things, and I learn from it. They learn from it. So it's all good. So again, it was good to be here. And thanks, KO, for getting us through this.
Of course. Thank you, Lindsey. Thank you very much for doing this. We'll definitely have you back for another webinar. Lindsey, also, he's done a webinar before that is on our Facebook page, and I believe it's on our YouTube page as well, so go back and check that out if you are looking for some more knowledge. So thank you, everyone, for hanging around with us. And thank you, Lindsey.
Thanks, Gail.